In the early stages of researching and writing Move, Think, Rest, I thought the title of this book would be Invisible Work, because my premise is that it's often when we step away from the desk, when our work isn't trackable and traceable, that our most generative work is happening. And it turns out the neuroscience of the brain shows that we actually need to toggle between that neofrontal cortex and the default mode network, zooming in, zooming out to do our best work.
Welcome to another episode of Building Brand Gravity. I'm Steve Halsey.
And I'm Ann Green. Nice to see you, Steve, in this cold weather we're having right now.
Great to see you as well.
Yeah, you know, Steve, when we were thinking about our intro today, I just can't get away from the inescapable amount of talk about and focus on AI these days, especially regarding workforce too. And, you know, I think rightly so. But as we've touched on in so many of our prior podcast discussions, I think one of the most critical factors in this transformation is not technology. It's us, the humans.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Ann. I mean, what's really striking to me is we've spent so much time over the last couple of years talking about what AI can do, right? Faster content, smarter analysis, more automation. But we really haven't spent nearly enough time talking about how humans show up differently in this environment. Because I think that's the real advantage is not just technical fluency, it's the judgment, the creativity, it's the context, right? So, and it's also the ability to ask better questions and connect those ideas in ways that the machine can't and decide what actually matters. And as you said, I think that's where the human layer becomes not just relevant, but essential.
Yeah, and I am happily seeing more discussion about how this AI transformation moment and really societal transformation too has to be as much about people as technology. I think you and I have agreed that was really missing from the dialogue almost entirely in 2024 and was still pretty thin in 2025. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, yet there's also so much dissonance that people are feeling about the space, right? It's like, I'm constantly talking about that dynamic tension of encouraging folks to embrace and experiment with the thing that they also just secretly and not so secretly worry, does this take my job? And, you know, on the AI and job subject, I was reading a newsletter you and I read all the time, Diane Brady's Fortune CEO Daily. And it was actually today when we're recording. And she reports on a discussion she had at Davos with the CEO of Recruit Holdings. Now, for those who aren't familiar with that name, Recruit Holdings is the entity that owns both Indeed and Glassdoor. So they got a lot of human-centric insight. That CEO is saying to Diana that he feels from the research that only a small fraction of recent layoffs in 2025, et cetera, can be directly attributed to AI. Yet he also said that workers are feeling real anxiety that this is exactly what's happening. So they went on to discuss also the fact that there absolutely will be changes in how leaders assess and source talent. And I know you and I agree that that is true. There's no doubt about it. So I guess ultimately for me, as I reflect on this, it continues to point to that need to think differently about work and then also our specific contributions as humans in the loop.
Yeah, and I think that's the tension right now, Ann, that so many of us are feeling. I mean, on the one hand, the data doesn't support, as you point, the idea that AI is going to just wholesale replace all our jobs overnight. But on the other hand, for so many of us, the very nature of the work we're doing is clearly changing. And that creates uncertainty and that creates very real anxiety. And so I think what we're seeing in his shift isn't whether humans are needed, it's what humans are needed for, right? It's really moving from kind of thinking about the use of AI and the AI human connection as purely transactional or repetitive work replacement to one where it's really now, how can they be married, so to speak, in synthesis, creativity? And that's kind of what, I don't know, you know me, I like to make up terms. My new one is meaning making. So meaning making is how can we focus more on contribution over execution? So that's what I love about what you're talking about this idea of humans in the loop, not so much from a dystopian safety net. Let's, make sure somebody can press the off button on this thing, but really what is that value multiplier? Because the future of work, I really don't believe it's about competing with machines. It's about collaborating with them and learning how to integrate the things that only people can do in a very meaningful way.
So all of this, we've been talking about the nature of work shifting, what we're discovering about what humans can do, the meaning making. This all really resonates with the conversation I had earlier today with Natalie Nixon. Now, that name may sound familiar to frequent listeners. She appeared on Building Brand Gravity in early 2025, where we interrogated an excellent question, which is, are we all creative? And spoiler, her answer is yes. She has a ton of insight and data to share on that topic. And I'm kind of obsessed with her framework of tapping into both wonder as well as rigor. And that's core to what she talks about. So I really encourage listeners to check that one out. But Natalie is back. She has a new book titled Move, Think, Rest, which digs deeply into understanding how work and productivity, our whole idea of productivity, has to shift with the changing times. She's worked across multiple fields, including as an academic, and she's now, an author and a very sought after public speaker and also a creativity catalyst for all kinds of organizations. We had such a rich discussion, Steve. I can't wait to get it out in the world. So with that, here is my conversation with friend of the pod, Natalie Nixon. I'm so thrilled to welcome the wonderful Natalie Nixon back to Building Brand Gravity for her second episode. And for those who remember her from last year, friend of the pod, she is a very multi-hyphenate career person, has been an academic, has been an author, now a new book, which we're going to discuss, a prior book, and consultant, and just all-around creative person, and a friend of mine. Natalie, so good to see you.
Good to see you, and thank you so much for having me back. Excited for our conversation.
That's right. So last year, for those who missed it, you can go to our YouTube page or on wherever you get your podcast and find our episode where we talked a lot about creativity. It was tied to Natalie's last book, The Creativity Leap: Unleash Curiosity, Improvisation, and Intuition at Work. And that was a lot about the question of, are we all creative? And I highly recommend that episode. But I was super excited to bring Natalie back now because she has a new book. It's called Move, Think, Rest. I've got it right here. And you can tell I'm reading it, Natalie, because the dust jacket is at home, right? That's my tell that I'm actually reading this book and carrying it around with me. But the subtitle is Redefining Productivity and Our Relationship with Time. So I have to start, Natalie, with the foreword quote to your book. And I have it here. To all of us who want to do less better. What does this statement mean to you, and why did you start the book that way?
Well, I started the book this way actually because I was given an award by a speaker community the category in which I won was my award was entitled Do Less Better. And I was in the middle of writing Move, Think, Rest when I received this award. And I think the reason I won in that category was because they were observing that I worked in a very scrappy way, that I work in a very lean way. And part of that is out of need. And part of that is as one grows as an entrepreneur in business, it's about hiring the right people to scaffold you. And I've increasingly done that. But as I was writing this book, that's a fresh take on productivity, that's examining the ways we have thought about productivity and might want to re-examine it because of burnout, new rules for work, and ubiquitous technology. I thought this premise of doing less better is really relevant. It's not about being less productive, but it is about being much more discerning, intentional about the ways that we are using our time, shifting away from only an outputs metric and orientation about what is valuable in our work to how we can be approaching work in a much more integrative way so that we are fulfilled, so that it's not about busyness and an addiction to busyness. It's not about productivity theater, but it's about being very intentional about what we do with our time, which means we may be doing less, but because we are integrating, and I know we'll talk about this more, movement and thought and rest into the workday, whether we are working solo or in a team in a large organization, we actually will contribute much higher quality output. So that's what that do less better proclamation is really about.
No, I love it. And I feel we're all, I used to call it the cult of busyness, where people wield it like a weapon, like, I'm so busy. And it really is a very just puts you right down the drain because everybody can wield their own busyness and it's not that productive. But I do want to peel back the core tenet of your book. And I think there was a bit of a history lesson in the beginning, which was really fascinating, which is the history of productivity and how we understand it today. And it's this central organizing principle in our lives, right? Yet in many ways, it feels like it's either invisible or that we all just assume we know what it means. Like, what are we talking about when we're talking about productivity? And I think this is becoming even more acute now, given what's happening with AI. So can you give us some grounding here in how we're understanding productivity today and where you have some critiques of that? I know it's a big question, but whatever you feel is helpful to ground us in this conversation.
Well, it's very interesting that you did use the word invisible, because in the early stages of researching and writing Move, Think, Rest, I thought the title of this book would be Invisible Work, because my premise is that it's often when we step away from the desk, when our work isn't trackable and traceable, that our most generative work is happening. And it turns out the neuroscience of the brain shows that we actually need to toggle between that neofrontal cortex and the default mode network, zooming in, zooming out to do our best work. I didn't call it invisible work because I did not want to detract from the work of feminists who have really done a lot of important work to talk about women's unaccounted for work, which is invisible work. So I didn't want to conflate the two. But when I was setting out to offer an alternative way for us to think about the workday, the ways we design policy around work in our organizations, the way we take care of ourselves so that we do our best work, I realized I had to first understand what I was reacting to. And so the first industrial revolution is still something that lingers in the ways that we think about our best work. So the first industrial revolution took place starting around the 1860s, and it really began a process of valuing work that was what I call an either or model of work. And it was a model that really valued output, speed, efficiencies. You measure only what you can see. And the challenge is that a lot of the ways that we do work today is not traceable. So, for example, the gross domestic product does not measure email. It doesn't account for search engine work. Two of the biggest things that help knowledge workers at least do the work. And so then I started thinking about, well, what did the world of work look like for the most part before the first industrial revolution? And most economies were agricultural economies. And then I started playing around with this metaphor of cultivation. I know we probably get into that a little bit more later, but that's a bit more of a both and model. And when we cultivate, it's not either or, we're measuring the solo practitioner and the collective. We value both. We value speed, but we also understand the role of slow over time. And we also know that, yes, we have to measure what we see. And there's a lot that's happening when we need to sleep on it. We need things to percolate and marinate. So the gentleman who is really tied to the first industrial revolution is Frederick Winslow Taylor, who was a big industrial engineer. He actually valued creativity, but he was known for, during factory work, really trying to, down to the minute, use a stopwatch to understand speed and efficiency of humans, because we were really trying to get humans to mimic the machine. And I think fast forward to the 21st century, the opportunity is not for humans to mimic AI, our newfound machine, but to figure out how the machine can amplify what makes us uniquely human, can be much more of our co-pilot, our co-creator, and not be the endpoint, but the catalyst. And a lot of times to help us do greater critical thinking, to help us now make time for spaciousness, for more meaningful collaboration, and those sorts of things that are so important for our best work to get done.
There's so much that you said I resonate with. I'm such a both and person. I mean, anybody who works with me here or clients would know the binary thinking is so destructive in so many ways. And we're seeing that in our society as a whole, right? The zero-sum game. And truly multiple things are true at once. And I like the idea of the both and of valuing, let's say, those outputs, but also the rumination that comes from it. And I also think that some of that history and that background, the framework, it kind of helps us understand like what system are we in right now and why does it produce itself like this? And it touches on so many things I'm thinking about deeply as a leader, which is what is the human and the machine interaction? How do we create a future, not sitting around being like, gee whiz, Sam Altman, what will happen to us in the future? It's like all respect to OpenAI, but what is the future we want to see and envision? And what is that interplay of man and machine? Because machines have upsides and downsides. I'm talking about the AI of it all. And also humans have upsides and downsides. And so to get back to, I think the other big connection for my next question to you is that there's been such a wrestling over the past, I don't know, few decades, but more acutely the last few years. I think COVID put this in sharp relief about that integrativeness of us as humans and workers and the mental health piece and the mindfulness and when are we overwhelmed by tasks and pings and notifications? I mean, you and I just shut up all our notifications before we got on this podcast, right? And that keeping the brain, I think of it on the track, versus what you're talking about, move and think and rest. And what is that, as you call it, MTR framework?
Well, so the Move, Think, Rest framework is a very integrative framework. What it is not saying is first you move, then you think, and then you rest. Maybe that would be lovely if it was in that nice, neat, pat order, but that's not actually what we need. That's not how we move through the world and through our day. And as I was writing and researching and doing up to 60 interviews for this book, I realized that I couldn't even write it in that very siloed way. I mean, there's a chapter on move, there's a chapter on thought, there's a chapter on rest, but I really signaled for the readers early on that this is very integrative, that there are times when you're moving where your best thoughts emerge. There are times when that your form of rest sparks greater thought. And it might even be the rest is actually a break. So when I talk about movement, I'm talking about movement hygiene. I'm not talking about get a gym membership. I'm really advocating for our reckoning that an acknowledgement that we are designed to move because the spinal cord is an extension of the brain. And if we sit for too long at the laptop and get cramped up, we will restrict and constrict blood flow to the brain, which means we will limit oxygen to the brain, which means we will not be doing our best thinking. And that even goes for people who have to drive an Amazon delivery truck all day or standing at a cash register in a retail environment. How are we practicing movement hygiene so that there's diversity in movement and that we are allowing people to have some agency in how they're moving? Because when we move, our ideas move. That's the link there. When I talk about thought, I'm not only talking about rational, cognitive, clear decision making, which we want our leaders to have, but how do you get that? You actually get that through what I call backcasting and forecasting. And backcasting is about reflection, memory, pausing, metacognition. Why do we think the way we think about this problem on our team? Forecasting is about imagination, curiosity. It's about inspiration. Both backcasting and forecasting require us to pause. And that's essential because that actually will sharpen our cognitive, rational thought processes and strategic decision making. And then rest is, I'm not advocating for necessarily about every company should have a nap room in the building. That's not what I'm saying. Although that's your work culture, cool. I'm really talking about thinking about rest, which is different from sleep. Sleep is incorporated in rest. Thinking about micro breaks, scaling it out to what might a sabbatical look like. So among the people I interviewed people in the tech industry where companies grant sabbatical every 5 years. I interview people at nonprofit organizations, not just higher education, where we're accustomed to hearing, oh, faculty, they get to have sabbaticals. No, but nonprofit organizations where they incentivize and really encourage people to take a sabbatical. And encourage is really an operative word there when we talk about sabbatical, because it could be part of the policy, but if it's not modeled by leaders, people don't take the sabbatical. They fear that they'll get a slap on the wrist if they do take the sabbatical. So movement, thought, and rest is about movement, hygiene, backcasting and forecasting, intermittent rest that can be done within one day as well as throughout a year. And I was really interested in what that human-centered operating system looks like for the individual, the team, and the organization. So, and as you know, I really try to practice what I preach in terms of my wonder rigor methodology. And so there's a lot of provocation that I seed in the book, but I also offer very practical, tactical ways, the rigor, for people to begin to exercise these ideas. So every chapter has reflection questions and exercises for the team, for the organization, for the individual to start to experiment with. But that's the model. And it's interesting, we've had books that only talk about the role of movement in exercise in an organization in our workday, or only talk about the value of rest, or only talk about the ways we're thinking and our different thought processes. But to really integrate the three was my goal here.
Yeah, I noticed that. I was thinking of it as the power of three in a way, and the interplay. I know movement's always been important to you, being a dancer back in the day and still today. Dancing, swimming, I know is something you're very committed to. Open water swimming, which is intense. And I have gotten back into movement. I love yoga. I'm doing strength training, gyms like Orange Theory, and finding that strength again, being in my mid 50s and kind of meeting myself again at this time of life, right? Which is a very common thing for women of this age. And one thing I noticed I was reflecting on in the book, I mean, there's so many places I can go from this, but I'll keep it to one of the questions I'd sent to you. In reflecting on myself over recent years, and just being on my own journey of how can I be the best person and the best leader, because those to me are very connected, right? Living my values, how do I want to show up? I've really noticed in my brain activity, if you examine your thoughts and are mindful, my mind has coded various activities, either productive or non-productive. And there's a whole host of emotions about myself and my worth or my value, and whether I have a good day or I have earned rest or fun that are deeply tied to whether I've been productive. Now, I'm lucky because certain things like exercise are coded as productive. Cooking, my brain is like, check, check, you're in the green checkbox, not the red side. But I'm trying to decouple this and really interrogate it, because I don't think that kind of thinking, if you're running on autopilot and you're not interrogating those thoughts, I don't think they're helpful personally or professionally. So does this resonate with you in the research you did and what you reflected on, these internal scripts that run tied to these ideas about productivity?
Yeah, it's so interesting. Whenever I have conversations about move, think, rest, we inevitably seem to hone in on the rest component. And I think, when I think about the dimension of this operating system that I have to be more intentional about, for me, it's definitely the rest piece. And what I would say is the shift and the reframe that I want people to get is that rest is not optional. Rest is not reward. Rest is integral to doing our best work. Rest is actually risk mitigation. Rest is actually going to build operational resilience. And we know we have all sorts of case studies and case stories when we go as individuals, as teams, as organizations, we miss things, right? We don't do our best thinking. We don't ask the best questions. The Navy SEALs famously have ascribed to slow is smooth and smooth is fast, right? It builds inconsistency. So what I want people to understand is, first of all, I love that you called out that self-judgment that we all I am definitely have to catch myself on, and to build in a lot more compassion. And that compassion mindset, in my view, is going to distinguish the best organizations in the future of work. The future of work will be distinguished by companies that have leadership that practice what I call inside out work versus just like this outward pushing focus work. The leaders that understand that stories are data too, that yes, the quant, the spreadsheets, the metadata, the all of the big data is significant. It shows us patterns. The qualitative dimension of work is going to be increasingly important in a world where basic tasks are increasingly going to be taken over by AI and such. So that qualitative dimension of self-compassion um, will will be um, will be best reflected in premier organizations by leaders who show compassion, who show curiosity, who show dimensions of frankly transparency and vulnerability, who show that self-reflexivity about asking a question such as, that competitor that we kind of said we never want to, we're seeing them as the enemy, or we don't want to do work with them. I started thinking differently about this because something that happened with my kids' soccer team this weekend, or something I read in an article, I wonder if we might revisit that. Does anyone else think that we might find a way to explore co-opetition instead of competition? But that self-reflexivity is an example of that inside out work. And that's an example of thought, right? That's an example of the type of thinking that I'm talking about, where we pause, we slow down to zoom out in order to see the bigger picture. So what I really want to, people to take away is that these are not principles that are additive, that are one more thing to do, but they are really, if we play our cards right, and if you read the book and institute some of my tips and techniques, are totally feasible to really attract and retain the best talent and to have an A+ organization.
Now, there's so many connections I'm making. I always say to my people, our business is a tapestry because there's so many interwoven threads. And to see it more as a tapestry than all these siloed things that are happening, like this is happening here, new business is happening here. But a couple of things we've talked about as well is what is a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. Obviously, Carol Dweck and many others have worked on that. But understanding that there's ways of thinking and seeing and being mindful of interrogating, like, how am I thinking? Which also relates to things like implicit bias, which we try to understand in the context of, say, diversity and equity and belonging. There's so many of these things about stepping back and saying, what is the thought processes that are like, what are the files that are running here and what are they saying to me? But I like the idea too. It requires a bit of emotional intelligence because this goes right back to, you said it best. In the future, there will be many tasks that we measured as output that will not be necessary for humans to do, but there will be so much more in terms of context and meaning creation and interpretation and connection and humanity that are critical. And that actually relates to another quote in the book that I vigorously underlined, which is, you said, we aren't, and I could not co-sign on this more, we aren't experiencing a tech revolution, we're experiencing a human revolution. So I'd love you to unpack that for me because I am way on that train too. And I'm wondering if some of our thoughts about it are similar.
The reason why I say that we're not in the midst of a tech revolution, we're in the midst of a human revolution, is just, number one, it's the root of that is just my total frustration with our tech crush. I call it our tech infatuated, tech crush, where we forget that at the end of the day, the technology is a tool. So, and what is the so what behind that tool? The so what behind the technology, in the best of circumstances, is that it gives us time for spaciousness. Because we can get the answers so much more quickly, it actually is now affording us an opportunity to have that self-awareness, that self-compassion, that self-care. It affords us the time as leaders to think more critically and more intentionally about the ways that we are leading. It actually opens up opportunities for us to build our creative capacity as organizations. And that really is the so what behind this move, think, rest, human-centered operating system. The reason why working in this way is so important is because it begins to seed a capacity for creativity that means we will be able to consistently innovate and deliver more purpose-driven business results. That's the real reason. The move, think, rest is a means to an end, and that end is building creative capacity, which I'm really passionate about. And if we think about some of the most striking fintech and ed tech frauds that we have lived through as society recently, whether it's Sam Bankman-Fried or if it's Elizabeth Holmes or if it's I'm lapsing on the name of, there was an ed tech scandal where the person fraudulently said that their mailing list or data list was much larger than it was. In all of those circumstances, if we zoom out, the challenge was, number one, there was some FOMO going on. We've got to reach the finish line first. And number two, no one was pausing to ask a different question, to start to critically reflect on what was being presented to them. And these are just three examples of some really expensive mistakes and moral and ethical dilemmas that begin to reveal themselves when we don't practice a different model of leadership. But that human revolution is the opportunity. It's an opportunity to behave differently. It's an opportunity to interact differently because of the technology. So shifting again, reframing and thinking about what does all this technology mean for me as a person, as a human. Now, I am not 100% rosy colored glasses about the tech. I'm well aware about the ethical challenge of the technology, the sustainability challenges of the technology, the water usage of the technology. And in the meantime, what are the ways that we can make sure we recenter humans in this conversation? That's what I think is very important to do.
I couldn't agree more. And it's funny to add to your list of things. I find it funny that we're all walking around now having to ask ourselves, will the advent of artificial general intelligence be like an extinction event for our species? That's why it's so much pressure on us, I think, as workers and as people, such a seismic change where it's all on the table. There's like the day-to-day, well, I have a job, but there's also this like existential thing that you can't just discount. And I really invite my team and everyone I encounter. I was just at our shared alma mater mentoring sophomores, as happens every year, which is an amazing program. But I was really encouraging them to build their AI narrative and their thoughts about it and their hands-on and hold both possibilities at once. But I said to them, look, you have to think of the 100,000 foot as well as ground level too about this. But one of the transitions that I want to make and ask you about this, because it's very practical for me. So, this is my way of getting your advice, Natalie, is that in my field, in the agency world, and there's many kinds of agencies in marketing communications, this question of inputs, outputs, impact. In my field, as you well know, as being a professional services person too, we measure productivity, have tended to, based on a very 20th century model, the billable hour, an hour of a human's time. Therefore, the calculation of our scope of work, our budgets, and ultimately somehow our success is by that cost of human per hour rubric. And many forces, like AI is one of them, is intensifying a discussion we've been having for a long time, myself and leaders across many firms and consulting as well, about what is the impact? Can we shift to that? What is the impact? What is the purpose of this project and the value of it, value-based pricing, et cetera, versus just billable time? There's a lot of prognostication that, it's all going to go to that. It has to change to that, et cetera. But it's been very hard to make that change because the way the corporate sector is set up and many of our clients are, and procurement and other structures are very, very much set up and delineated around that kind of conversation around the billable hour and those kind of input-output. So what do you think about that tension between input, output, impact, and what are you trying to start to advance in the book on this conversation?
Well, the tension that you've just outlined is really pointing out the opportunity for systems change, which is really painful too, right? Like my husband, John, is an attorney. The entire revenue model for law firms is based on billable hours. And we have this conversation all the time. The shift to value-based pricing means a shift in the sorts of questions that you ask. So one really good question to start to ask of yourselves and of your clients is, what is at stake if the work, the impact of our work does not happen? And when you begin to delineate what is at stake, unintended consequences, the additional costs, if this doesn't happen, you begin to really clearly see the value of the work, which is exceptional, right? It's exceptional because of sunk costs, of missed opportunities, of new sorts of awareness and new future scenarios that you can point to start driving your business, which open up new revenue streams. So a lot of it is requiring us to ask very different sorts of questions, which is just a very different muscle to use. So the value conversation, and it's linked to the Move, Think, Rest operating system. The connection that I see there is around the value that we're putting on our time, the value that we're putting on the sorts of people that we have around the table, that there are diverse experiences and perspectives that make sure that we are actually asking different sorts of questions that lead to a different output, that lead to a different impact, that lead to different value. The other piece about value is that value allows us to be much more expansive in the way we think about the outcome. Value is allowing us to challenge our assumptions. When we say that this work equals X, we are assuming that we know exactly what the apple will be. And that's very comforting, right? We want to be able to say that in a quantifiable way, I can guarantee X, which in a lot of cases we still can do. Value, though, also is an and, a yes, and we're also adds to the conversation the additional impact, the additional consequences, the additional attributes that can come from the work. And I think that the Move, Think, Rest human-centered operating system is inherently much more values based because it begins to expand the way we think of the human input into the work.
I like that suggestion of we have to stop and reframe the question of what is this work for? What are the implications if it doesn't get done? What is the benefit of saying having an outside party? You know, it's the work we have to now interrogate going forward. What can AI do, or platforms? What do humans uniquely have to do? So I think that's helpful to me in thinking about, you know, how we keep reframing this, because we're in the thick of this and we're going to keep having this conversation. And I do think it's going to be a both and. I don't think every entity that we work with will suddenly switch to this model. I think the billable hour is quite hard to say goodbye to on many levels. But if we can start to evolve and sort of shine a light on the path to get there, I think that's going to be very helpful for our industry.
Billable hours is hard to say goodbye to because there's an entire system
Yes.
dependent on it, right?
Yes.
So we can't get rid of the entire system overnight, and maybe we shouldn't. So what are prototypes that you can begin to launch? What is one particular client engagement or initiative where you could test out this very different pricing model? So prototypes are a beautiful thing. They simultaneously excite teams and terrify them, because prototypes mean that you're experimenting. It means that the answer can be, wow, that was a total fail. But what did you learn? You know, I'm from Philly, the home of the Philadelphia Eagles, and our quarterback, Jalen Hurts, loves to say, there's only winning and learning. He doesn't like that paradigm, win, fail, win, lose. It's winning and learning, right? So that's what a prototyping culture begins to acclimate you towards. So think about, what is one small, low stakes way that we can start to experiment with a very different pricing model? What do we learn from it? What's the feedback? What then can we build on that? And that, to me, is the way to begin to address systems change. And we all know that in a system, you change one element and there's a cascading effect. So it's not about being totally disruptive. That's not practical. That's not feasible. It doesn't really make sense. But if you think about what's a prototype, and when I say prototype, sometimes when I work with clients, they go to what I call the Audi version. Before you get to the Audi version, there's a tricycle version, there's a motorcycle version, let's say scooter. Then there's the Audi, right? The sedan. But what's the duct tape, scrawled, scribbled, doodle, tricycle version of this that you can begin to try? And what do you learn? And then what's the feedback loop that you build on your team, with your organization to share out so that there is a lot of input? Because when people feel part of the problem solving process, they're more likely to be vested in the change.
Absolutely. Because I have so much family in Philly, and for you, I will say go birds, that since you evoke the Eagles. I love the prototype piece, though. There's actually a client that's very creative that we're working with in a new model that we talked to them about, very much what you're saying, kind of saying mixture of human and supported by AI, sped by it, and quality control, and saying this may be a more productive way to go forward for both you and us, win-win. And there's actually discount involved in it, but there's still a sense of the profitability that will come on our side. So we're in that moment of experimentation. And I think I was talking another episode of this podcast that's going to come out before yours and mine does. I interviewed somebody who's a real expert in AI, and we were talking about how terrible everyone says upskilling, but no one in our society is committed to doing it. And he said a lot of it is not to him upskilling, it's updoing, just do, get committed, get hands-on. And I think some of this requires that bravery to prototype, experiment, get out of your headspace. For me, I mentioned earlier, I have a metaphor of times when I feel I have to it's like my brain is a train and it has to stay on the rails, keep moving forward, and you have to produce. But there's another metaphor, that's my one metaphor, and sometimes you need to be highly controlled. There's another metaphor I've always thought about, which is when I allow myself some space, I imagine the brain is like the stone skipping across the pond. And if you allow your thoughts it's like the stone skip, skip, skip. And what I find is that my thoughts will follow a path and I don't even know where they're going. And I'll have to trace the stone skip. Like, how did I get to that thought? Because I'm letting the brain be a little bit free. And I find metaphorically thinking like that helps me to feel where is that expansiveness? Because as a CEO, I have to do a lot of but I also need time to set back and say, where are we going? Why? What can I offer to our team to make it legible? What is the stories or the metaphor? What's our theme for this year? What's the strategy? And I do feel that sense of sort of taking the shackles off your mind and your body to move and then also to rest. I think that's why this has resonated so much with me. Does any of those metaphors resonate with you, Natalie?
I think I love your metaphor of the skipping a stone through water. I'll give you another water metaphor that I think is actually probably much more germane than the train metaphor for the reality of how we work. The reason why metaphors are so powerful is because we are highly visual creatures. And when we have that visual in mind, it helps us to stay on track. It helps us to anchor ourselves into the why. And what you just described, you are allowing yourself as a leader to pause and to self-reflect, to question, everything from, why do we choose to meet this way? I always go back to the OG of organizational artifacts, which is the meeting. The way we meet is a wonderful place to start to think through this move, think, rest operating system, to think through do we have to do a Zoom? Can we walk and talk in person? Can we use the old school phone and do a more oral way of working and meeting? But the other metaphor that I'd like to seed, and I would like to recommend a book that maybe I hope your organization is interested in reading, Move, Think, Rest, but I'm going to give another book that's been incredibly impactful to me. The other metaphor that I think is much more germane to how we lead and how we work is to think about sailing. Now, I don't know how to sail. I'm infatuated with sailing. I love Christopher Cross's good old yacht rock song "Sail." But from what I understand about sailing, there are times where you can just coast, but there are other times when you got to lean into the wind. There are other times when you have to tack the sail in a different way so that it can catch the wind. It's so rich of metaphor, and I highly recommend that you and your leadership team, your entire organization, read a great book called First You Have to Row a Little Boat. Man, I came across this book in remember Borders bookstores? It was either a Borders or a Barnes and Noble in the late 1990s. I was in my late 20s. It's a little book. It's probably only 5x7 in dimension, maybe a little larger than that. Paperback, probably was in hardback when I first got it. And I devoured the book. Number one, because I always hope to sail. Still not too late for that, but I'm more open water swimming right now. But I loved the rich metaphor for life and how you first have to row a boat before you graduate to, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the author's name, but to eventually sail. But I think it's a wonderful leadership book. I think it's a wonderful book for right now, to understand how to. The author is Richard Bode, Bode. But I think sailing and using this metaphor of knowing when you have to lean in, when you have to go against, waiting, pausing, being cognizant of the environment. Man, it's such a helpful way to think about teaming, to think about leadership, to think about goal setting, to think about movement, thought, and rest. So I really recommend that book and that metaphor.
You know, it means so much to me. You said that my father was a sailor. I grew up sailing. And years ago, my husband's a musician, which you know, and we did a cover of Christopher Cross' song Sailing as a present for my father before he died years ago. And it's just such a precious thing to me. But the other thing with sailing or being on the water in general is that it reminds you there's things larger of yourself, which is the forces of nature. And we are all being buffeted by the wind right now, geopolitical, social change. As a leader, I'm spending a lot of time interrogating my own values because I don't like to create hysteria or upset, but I also don't love silence and stuff that I don't feel comfortable with. And so that idea of monitoring the winds, knowing there's certain times where there's a storm and you got to pull that sail down and you got to get to a safe port and you just got to care for your own people. I mean, there's a million things we could talk about that. So you really speak to my heart when you share that, Natalie. I love that. We talked about the fact that, you know, as we wind down, I could just talk to you forever about this stuff. And I just love talking to you in general. You end each chapter with a section you call Seeds to Cultivate. And you noted earlier, you ask tangible questions and exercises that speak to an individual, it speaks to a team, and it could speak to the whole organization. And I think that's really material because people can be good at one thing and not another. Like you're great at an individual performer, but you're kind of poor leading a team, or you're wonderful in the team environment, but you're not paying enough attention to the individuals, or there's the organization and how does it scale? What do you feel about the interplay between those three dimensions? And what do you hope that people do with those seeds to cultivate at the end of each chapter?
Well, I think the interplay is essential, and to toggle between me as an individual, awareness of how I work as a team, how I'm part of the larger ecosystem is a dance. And it takes practice to get better at that because each of us have a natural inclination of where we feel more comfortable or it's effortless, right? At the same time, when we are part of an ecosystem, when we're part of a larger organization, we have to build the muscle for each of those concentric circles of us as an individual, the team, and the organization. And what I hope people will do with the reflection questions, with the exercises, is to use them, is to start a book club, to use them, even if you use it as a prompt for 5 minutes at the start of a meeting for a short conversation. I want people to experiment with this very different way of working, that where the pushback can be, man, are you saying that my people should procrastinate? Are you saying that we should all be pausing? I'm not saying that. I'm actually saying that getting back to the reframe question, what's at risk if you don't? This is risk mitigation. This is a way to set boundaries, actually. It's actually a way to make sure that instead of saying work, which is boundaryless, you are actually integrating boundaries to ensure that your people feel seen and heard, and that they actually do their best work so that they actually have the ability to be creative. And because I'm a creativity strategist, I cannot leave our conversation without dropping a few statistical nuggets that are just a bit alarming and also inspiring. But, the World Economic Forum in their 2023 Future Job Skills Report designated creativity. They predicted the creativity would be the number 2 job skill by 2027, in a year from now. The first job skill they said was critical thinking. Another report, I think by Market Splash, said that 72%, or 70 to 80% of business leaders believe that creativity is essential for market competitiveness. So we have this great research and this really storied organization saying creativity is really essential for market competitiveness, for leadership. At the same time, other research shows that 70% of employees feel that they have no time at all during the year, maybe 2 times during the year, to exercise their creativity, to demonstrate their creativity, whether they work in a law firm, a meat packing factory, or in education, right? So there's this gap analysis between saying, yes, creativity is essential, at the same time as people not experiencing that they're given the space and time to practice that creativity. The Move, Think, Rest operating system is one on-ramp to help people to do that. It's one way to begin to shift to a leadership model and an organizational culture that hopefully will position you to become the employer of choice, the workplace of choice, because not only are you generating great product in whatever sector you're in, but you also are a great place to work, and you also allow you're designing the conditions for people's best work.
I love that. And I think the idea of the on-ramp, how do we have an on-ramp to create more space for ourselves for all of these things? And we've kind of gotten in the last 20, 30 years, just very much in a box of email, notification, work. And creating that space, I think, is going to be really helpful for us, especially, and very apropos and timely given the technology shifts that are happening. But Natalie, as always, it's a delight to see you, a delight to talk to you. For everyone listening, Move, Think, Rest, her new book, and check out Creativity Leap. I think you're going to be doing a new edition of that soon. So, I can't encourage folks enough to reach out to you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me, Anne. Always a pleasure.